Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Thrive Grand Rounds session. We'll get underway as people trickle in. Before diving in and introducing our speakers, just wanted to open with a land acknowledgement. We are hosting the session today from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. And we are lucky to have team members and participants joining from other territories across North America as well. Today's discussion will center around new privacy legislation in Canada and the impacts on the healthcare organizations. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. If you could enter questions into the Q&A tab in Zoom, please feel free to do that throughout today's presentation. We'll endeavor to address these questions as they come in. I'll be moderating as we go, and we'll just sort of mix my own questions with questions from the audience. So please don't hesitate to ask questions at any time. This session will also be recorded, and we are also live streaming across LinkedIn and other social media platforms. So thank you to everyone joining across those platforms. So before diving in, I'm going to do a quick introduction of our panel guests today. Very grateful to be joined by PrivacyWorks CEO Adam Stinson and Privacy Specialist Guilda Rostama. Adam is a seasoned privacy professional with a unique blend of privacy knowledge and project management expertise. He brings over a decade of experience in building privacy programs and completing privacy impact assessments. He holds a coach certification in health informatics and is the former chair of the Exam Development Board of Canada for the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Gilda is a GDPR expert who worked on the CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority, and the European Data Protection Board for more than 4 years. She has a PhD and is a qualified French lawyer with more than 8 years of professional experience. During her tenure in the CNIL, she has also been involved with a variety of initiatives which have led her to achieve an in-depth understanding of the obligations that weigh on organizations subject to GDPR. And really what our conversation is going to center around today is, what does this privacy landscape look like? What are the legislations that impact us? What are the legislations that we need to be aware of? And how do we need to be thinking about this? I think for any organization and for privacy leaders in those organizations and those who have privacy leadership in their portfolio, it's really easy to get tripped up in the alphabet soup of legislation and all the different frameworks and all the different rules. And I think at times we can lose sight of what really matters here, which is actually protecting the sensitive data that we as healthcare organizations are entrusted with by our users and by our stakeholders. And what I love about PrivacyWorks and why we've partnered with them is that they really do a great job of balancing that actual what matters, how do you do the right things, and how is that informed by the legislation that we need to be compliant with. So we'll dive in. I guess I'm supposed to introduce myself as well. I'm Alec McCauley, I'm the CEO of Thrive Health, and I'll be moderating today. So I'm going to hand it to Adam just to do a quick introduction and dive into the topic that we'll be discussing, and we'll take it from there. Over to you, Adam.
Sounds good. Thank you, Alec. And yeah, thanks everyone for the invite to come and join you today. We actually spoke with Alec and I guess a select member, a few members from Thrive a few weeks ago on a similar topic around, what's going on with this mishmash of changes across Canada and what do we really need to worry about, right? How is this going to affect us? So yeah, so good times and yeah, thanks again for the invite. Yeah, so PrivacyWorks. So we started this company, I started this company 10 years ago, largely to fill what I saw as a bit of a vacuum in this sort of privacy landscape. And boy, did I ever get the timing right. Even the concept of privacy and what that word means has changed so much over the last decade, and it's become much more ingrained in our vernacular and our consciousness, and certainly affects our day-to-day. Whether you work in a tech company like Thrive or at a health authority, et cetera. I mean, even Facebook was in its infancy about 10 years ago, and the field has exploded and grown so much. And while I try to keep a cool and calm demeanor, it's we're normally frantically running around with our hair on fire, just trying to keep up with all the changes that are going on and helping out our clients in doing so. So yeah, I guess that's about it.
So I'm wondering, maybe to start, if you could give us just a background, putting aside the changes that are coming in the Canadian privacy landscape. I'm wondering if you could just give maybe a quick overview of the legislation that applies to privacy in Canada, both federally and provincially, as well as the legislation we're influenced by, such as GDPR.
Sure, and I'm going to pull Gilda in to make sure that I'm staying honest there with all of this stuff. So across Canada, there's all kinds of different privacy laws, and for sure we're a large country geographically, but we're a fairly medium-sized country population-wise, and yet I believe at last count we had something like 38 different privacy laws in Canada. It's insane. So federally, there's the Privacy Act that applies to all federal employees and federal activities. And then each province then has and territories each has their own, typically a set of privacy laws. There are, if you go across sort of the main provinces, so typically there will be a private sector privacy law and a public sector privacy law applying just to public bodies. There are several provinces that then have privacy laws specific to healthcare, Ontario being the biggest. And then there are like field or sector specific laws that apply in certain cases. Gilda, anything I'm missing?
No, in Canada, no, it's good for, Alec mentioned GDPR, so I'll just hop into this. Yes, so we have the European law that was adopted in 2018 and is a little bit serving like the model for a lot of legislation updates, which is the General Data Protection Regulation. So it's supposed to be the highest standards in privacy, and so any like privacy legislative reform across the world, whether in the US or in Canada or in Asia, is always looked compared with the GDPR, and the standards are very high. So it's also you see that a lot of countries want to have more flexibility, but it's still known as the standard to comply with. In general, the GDPR is the law.
And I think,
no, go ahead, Adam.
Just one last little thought on that is, so with that sort of Canadian privacy landscape, it's very interesting the timing of a lot of these things. I think this will sort of lead into the conversation here a bit, is that so many of these laws are just incredibly outdated. And, here in BC as well. I think our private sector law in BC was last updated in 2003 or 2004. And obviously the entire world has changed and digitized since then. These laws are very much created for a world of silos, right? Where Saskatchewan didn't really share a lot of information outside of Saskatchewan. So obviously not the case anymore. And therefore a lot of these laws have become antiquated.
Yeah, and especially cloud technology, I think, obviously being a huge accelerator of that. And maybe just before we dive too much further, maybe just from a definition standpoint. So I know privacy and security and even maybe compliance often get kind of all thrown together. So maybe just a really quick primer when we're talking about privacy legislation, what are we actually talking about, and how does that extend into things like data residency and stuff like that?
Sure, that's a good question. So when we're talking about privacy legislation, it's generally quite specific, where they get into the collection, use, and disclosure of data. So essentially your data management practices. So how are you doing it? What's allowed and what's not allowed? In data residency is a perfect example. So in several provinces, two in Canada, they've had these data residency restrictions. So in BC and Nova Scotia, where for many, many years, no data was allowed to be stored or accessed from outside of Canada. And you put that into a 2022 context, and it even sounds ridiculous just to say it. But that is, that has been the world for quite some time, particularly here in BC. Security and compliance, again, two very separate concepts. So security tends to focus more around the controls, the specific technical controls that we can put in place to manage data. So privacy and security for sure go very much hand in hand. However, they are and certainly have and continue to diverge into very, very specific's not the right word, I guess, defined fields. Where we have people like us, where this is what we do is focus on privacy and try to help our clients with that. Whereas, as I'm sure you all know, there's a lot of cybersecurity firms out there that are doing the same thing. And then compliance, gosh, what a huge area that is, where compliance is really the ability to be able to demonstrate that you're meeting a certain bar. And those bars change all the time too. So typically the things we're talking about with compliance is, well, complying with a law. So we do a lot of like privacy impact assessments to make sure that, companies or initiatives are compliant with, XYZ law. But there are also, of course, like ISO standards and NIST standards and a lot of, definitely more so on the cybersecurity side. And yeah, just a lot of exercises to be able to demonstrate that you can hit that bar.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe on that theme, so obviously we have privacy legislation, which is what we're really going to dive into today. So we hear a lot about bills being introduced. And maybe just a quick background. So the difference between those bills and then things that I'm sure people have heard a lot about, like SOC 2 and ISO and the sort of frameworks, just what's the relationship between those things, and how do organizations best make use of those frameworks to be compliant in the landscape we find ourselves?
Sure. Well, certainly with things like ISO and SOC 2 and NIST and stuff like that, it's these are very industry-driven standards. So what they're trying to do is define best practice around, say, cybersecurity or whatever. I mean, I know ISO goes into a billion different things. Whereas when we're talking about the legislation and the introduction of these new laws, it's really about sort of painting the picture for a new landscape across Canada, but or specific to each province. Certainly, the privacy laws are much more specific and also much more enforceable as well, right? So with those laws come mandatory things, whereas with a lot of compliance things like SOC and NIST, organizations are doing it to be able to demonstrate that they can do this, whereas if you're breaking the law, you're breaking the law.
Yeah. So we find ourselves in this place where we've got this sort of mishmash of legislation we're trying to comply with. I know we struggle a lot, as everyone else does, is that, as you said, the legislation is just super out of date. So it's open to a ton of interpretation in terms of how it applies in a modern cloud world. Because, yeah, as you said, the days of data being stored in filing cabinets in an office in a province and that being the end of the story is long gone. So what's coming? What's coming in Canada? Let's start federally, and then we can work through the provinces.
Sure. And I'd love to agree with you, and yet we work with a lot of government clients where they do still keep stuff in filing cabinets and a lot of doctors' offices with paper-based charts. So that said, so what's coming? And Gilda, please just jump in here anywhere. So federally, the big push was called Bill C-11, and this was an attempt to modernize PIPEDA, which has been sort of the federal private sector legislation that applies across the board. It applies to all provinces unless your province has what they call substantially similar legislation in place, which is the case in British Columbia. And so with that update to that federal law comes all kinds of changes. A lot of it, one of the big ones, of course, that was introduced with Bill C-11 is around enforcement and the ability for commissioners to actually apply fines in the cases of non-compliance. So current status is the bill was introduced last year, which was very, very exciting. Us privacy nerds, that's an exciting thing for us. But then it kind of died on the vine, unfortunately. COVID, there's been a lot of priorities, obviously, with the government. So while we're mid-May now, so it's very unlikely that it'll be reintroduced before the summer. But everybody's very hopeful that it will get reintroduced and have sort of a second reading coming into the fall. Gilda, anything to add on the federal one?
No, on the federal, no, nothing. More on the provincial ones, but I think you're going to it now.
Yeah, well,
okay.
let's jump in there next, because at the same time, I know BC is in the middle of a big consultation to sort of update their privacy legislation. So maybe starting with BC and working outwards, what's coming at the provincial level?
Okay, yeah, let me do BC, and then Gilda, I'll turn it over to you. So BC is very interesting. So there were updates last year to FIPA, which is our public sector act. Not earth-shattering changes, but one of the most significant changes in there was, while not entirely removing this data residency requirements to keep data within Canada, it has certainly loosened it, and frankly, COVID loosened it, because there was such a demand from public sector to be able to use, particularly in healthcare, to be able to use virtual cloud-based technologies, and like now. So a lot of the we'll figure this out later just wasn't going to cut it anymore. So I think it was great. I think it put some oil in the engine and really got things moving on that front. While that data residency requirement in British Columbia, I think a lot of people have treated it over the years as a very cozy blanket, right? That it makes them feel good that, you know, we're keeping our data right here, and, you know, it's under our control. But the flip side to that argument is that, particularly, well, public sector, like all of our health authorities and hospitals, they just don't have access to all these technologies, and they're falling behind other provinces, left, right, and center. It's like trying to do their job with one hand tied behind their back. So that's on the public sector side, and potentially more changes to come there. The private sector side, so our PIPA legislation in BC, again, quite excited around this. So there was a special committee struck last year. There was, I think, 50 different recommendations that came out of that committee to modernize PIPA. And we're really hoping it comes through. Nobody knows the date. Unfortunately, I wish I did. I'd share if I did. But again, I think what it will do when it does come into place is sort of level set. It'll bring BC up to sort of the same place that a lot of other provinces are that have modernized their acts in recent years. I'm sure it paid very close attention to Bill C-11 federally, so that we'll be able to actually have some congruency with federal laws. There are certain things like currently BC, like one of the slam dunk things that's going to be in this PIPA update, for example, is around mandatory breach reporting. So if a company, not Thrive, any other company had an instance of inappropriate access to data or lost data or whatever that breach is, that now there's going to be a mandatory report going to the Privacy Commissioner's office, and likely repercussions coming out of that. The other update potentially on the BC front is we're one of the big provinces that doesn't have healthcare specific privacy legislation. We have the eHealth Act, which takes care of one small corner of it, but there's been a lot of work in it, and this has been, any of you that sort of work around the space have probably been hearing about this for about 10 years now, that it's coming. So I heard word recently that it's actually magically going to happen. I know it's a lot of work. I don't mean to minimize it. I know there's a lot of work goes into these things, but that will be really exciting. And the number one problem that we're having in British Columbia is in that healthcare space is the sharing of data between private and public, because PIPA and FIPA don't talk to each other very well, and they don't allow for these mechanisms of data sharing, particularly for things like secondary use and research, where other provinces are very, very fluid in this space. We're stumbling all over ourselves. We have these incredible data holdings with things like PharmaNet, TLIS, and even all the EMR data that's out there in private practice, and they can't mesh these things together without coming up with these creative agreement solutions, which it seems to take forever. So it's an exciting space in BC actually. I just wish it would go a little bit faster.
And just before we move across the rest of the country, just to clarify, so when we talk about provincial specific legislation, these are very much centered around the person whose data we're talking about, right? So if you have, users or stakeholders or employees in a province, you are subject to that province's privacy legislation. That's correct, right? For
sure. And particularly on the private sector side, it's very, in all provinces, it's very much centered around the concept of consent, right? And so it really boils down to that individual. Do they know what you're doing with their data? Like, are you providing adequate notice? Are you collecting consent when needed? And I think those provisions will only strengthen, frankly, as we see new legislation.
Yeah, let's talk about the rest of the country, and then we'll dive into some of those common themes. So I think it's very clear sort of where things are going. So yeah, why don't we talk maybe Quebec next, or what else is on the radar?
Sure. So we have Ontario first, but Ontario is also in a consulting kind of phase right now, where they released a white paper and they gathered some feedback and they're working on the proposal. So we haven't seen any draft or anything yet at that stage. But the most exciting one is Quebec, which has decided to move on and to actually adopt a new law, because none of the other provinces have done so. But Quebec has adopted its law called Bill 64 last year, and there's a gradual enforcement. So in this September, some obligations will be applicable, and then next year, and then the year after. So they're kind of giving time to organizations to get organized, because there's a lot of new obligations. So I think the main point of focus right now for organizations is to look at Quebec, because Quebec also has a quite broad scope of application. So it's not very clear, but mostly what the trend would be is that as soon as you collect, use, or disclose personal information that belongs to Quebec residents, potentially the Quebec legislation may be applicable to you, even if you are not based in Quebec. And so this could be a Canada-wide enforcement of this legislation. And I don't know, should I get into the trends now that we've identified a little bit in the?
Sure, let's do that. Yeah, let's.
Okay, great, great. So one thing I think that is important to remember is that when we look at all these provinces' legislation, and including the federal one, as Adam said, we're really going towards another model of enforcement, and there's going to be much higher penalties for privacy breaches and for breaches of the law, and the regulators are going to have an increased role. And for example, we are seeing that in Quebec now the fine for each breach of the law can go up to $10 million, or 2% of the worldwide turnover of the organization. So we're going towards, we were at the moment, we're still at the point where commissioners would give recommendations, and then organizations would think about it or take it to court. But right now we're going more a direct enforcement by regulators. And so that's one trend to be aware of. And
also, just sorry to interrupt, Gilda, but the flip side of that trend has been very, very prevalent across Canada forever, where our regulators, our privacy commissioners' offices, both federally and provincially, have been toothless, and they don't scare anybody, right? Because they can't really do anything except wag a finger a lot of times. I don't mean that in a bad way. They're the ones that have been screaming the loudest from the mountaintop, saying, if you give us these powers, we can start changing behaviors. So it's actually really nice to see that it's finally transpiring.
Yeah, and taking the example of Europe, it was exactly the same thing that happened with GDPR, that increased the fine power of these regulators, and now there's really a trend, like there's real changes that are happening for privacy. So I think their analysis is correct. So very high level. I'm not going to get in the details of the law, because I'm scared to be boring you too much, but just in a very, very high level, the trend that we need to know about. First, consent. Consent is already a masterpiece in the privacy legislation. So almost any collection, use, and disclosure of personal information would require consent, except in specific cases. And we see that the trend in all these provincial, like in Quebec, but also in the other provinces, is to reinforce that consent, and especially reinforce the transparency in that consent. So it's really about giving people the choice. For example, if they want to allow some usage and not others, they should, like Quebec says, they should be given the choice. And the notice that you give to individuals have to be very precise, and each purpose for which the data is going to be used, for example, has to be accurately explained. And there's also, in the same time, it's interesting because there is a recognition that sometimes people get tired of having to consent to everything. It's called the consent fatigue. And BC, for example, in its recommendation, does explicitly address that and saying that, yes, we have to also add flexibility. For example, we're not going to ask organizations to ask for consent if they're sending information to their service provider. That wouldn't make sense. So there is also this double trend of, okay, we're reinforcing consent, we're reinforcing transparency, but there's also some situations where consent should not have to be collected, and we see that there is the legislators do want to broaden those exceptions, so to provide more flexibility here. So that's, I think, the first trend that we see. The second important trend that we see is about privacy impact assessments that Adam mentioned. So for those of you who are not familiar with PIAs, they're really more, their objective is to assess if you're complying with a law, if you have risks, and then if you have those risks, to mitigate them. They're very, very, I think they're mandatory in most of the healthcare legislations, but it wasn't the case for private sector, and now it's becoming like this. And in Quebec, basically they're saying, anytime you want to have a project that is going to collect, use, or disclose personal information, you're going to have to do a PIA. And they even go one step further, and they say, if you want to transfer data outside of Quebec, you also need to do a PIA, which is a little bit strange because we're in the same country and we're supposed to have a similar level of protection across the provinces. But we see that Quebec is trying to affirm that their legislation is stronger, which it probably is today. But in a way, you have to do PIA in so many situations that that's a trend. And I don't know if the other provinces are going to follow that, but this is what we're seeing. And
that's, I'm just going to jump in on there. Like that, this is, I know with all of these themes, we've been sort of trying to give sort of a practical, this is what it means to you, right? I mean, this is where you're going to have to stop and actually put in effort now because of the change in these laws. And this is one of them. Doing these PIAs, I mean, it can be a pain, right? I mean, they're very detailed. They can take a while to do. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it's going to become more of the norm. I think in the private sector, it's very normal in the public sector for sure. And hey, good for privacy consultants. So
exactly. But yes, PIs in Quebec, it's a very heavy procedure, and even the GDPR, which is, as we said, talked about the standard law for in Europe, is not going to that extent. So Quebec is really actually going further than GDPR on this. Another thing that maybe is going to be heavy, but is also important, is now that organizations will have mandatory privacy programs. So what is a privacy program? When we talk about privacy programs, we talk about the whole management framework of the personal information. So we're talking about having records, having tables, having privacy policies, having a person that's responsible for privacy in the organization, process, procedures. It's very, very heavy. And the Quebec is having a privacy program mandatory, according also to this size. So they're bringing some flexibility and saying that, yes, if you're a very small organization, you don't have any sensitive personal information, the size of your privacy program will be adapted according to this situation. But what is interesting is now organizations will also have to publish details on their program, on their policies, on their website, and that's very new. And some other provinces are also following, like Ontario in its proposal was following also that trend of it's not only about how the personal information that we collect, that we use and disclose, but how we're treating it inside our organization, what's happening there. So, but there is this question of what is detailed information. Are you going to have to reveal everything that happens? No, I don't think so. But it's still providing reasonable information so that a person can be reassured that you have some process defined to handle complaints, for example, or to handle inquiries and things like that. So
this is one of those areas where
yeah.
it's again, like there's going to be some heavy lifting on behalf of a lot of private sector organizations that have tried to sweep this kind of stuff under the rug and just not pay a lot of attention to it over the years. We tend to field a lot of questions on stuff like this. It's like, okay, so these laws are coming. There's all these changes. Like, do I really have to care? Do I need to care yet? That was certainly the case with GDPR, certainly for North American companies for many years. It's like, okay, everybody's talking about these fines and all this stuff, and do I really need to care? And a lot of it was like, just let's hold on and see. But now with some years under their belt and some experience of chasing after those fines, it's a very real thing. And so I think with these trends that Guild is going through, it really goes to show that I guess one way to summarize what she's talked about so far is demonstratability, and that's kind of the word I've been using a lot with clients. Is you got to be able to demonstrate that you care, right? Because if something goes wrong, or if you have a breach, or whatever, or what we're seeing is some of these requirements are also being industry driven too. So if you want to re-sign your cybersecurity insurance, well, okay, you're going to have to demonstrate that you've got all of these things in place. We saw one recently with Amazon where it was Amazon that was demanding of a client that they demonstrate that all of they've got this breach response plan in place, or else they wouldn't sign a contract. And I'm like, So it kind of goes back to Alec, your first question about the difference between laws and then compliance, right? I mean, one of them, sure, you could break the law, you get fined by the law, but on the flip side of that, you can't get through the door if you don't do these things properly in the first place.
And yeah, and I agree that demonstrability is huge. I think disclosure is the other big theme there too, in terms of just them wanting to be really proactive. I think that should be a theme for everyone here, is that plan to be very over disclosure in terms of breaches. Just one question about the privacy management program, because I think we all, especially myself coming from the SaSS space, we think about users. I know in healthcare organizations we default to patients, but just talk quickly about the scope of these privacy programs, because it covers employees too, and a lot of internal things, right?
Sure. Yeah, and the way we look at it is kind of a soup to nuts approach. So so employees, you'd be looking at things like your internal privacy policies, the way you're collecting data on your employees, and policy is such a boring word, but it does encompass a pretty broad spectrum, right? So anywhere from like your website privacy policy down to like, what's your retention policy? I mean, how are you keeping data? And not just your customer data, but your employee data as well. That's an area where a lot of companies have gotten in a lot of trouble because they're hanging on to stuff for 15 years and there's no reason for it whatsoever. Again, one of the trends, we could go on all day about these trends. One of the other trends that I'm sure Gilda was about to get to was around just customer control or individual control, right? Where they can start requesting access to their own information, which we see more in healthcare now because there's digital tools to be able to do it. But that goes across, it's not just Dr. X, show me my healthcare record for the past 10 years. They can go to a bicycle shop or to Thrive or anything like that and say, hey, we want to know exactly what information you've got on me. And therein, sorry, long answer to a short question, but the privacy program then builds around all of that, right? So how do you respond to these subject access requests, which are becoming more and more popular? Policies are part of it. Like, do you have a breach management strategy? Have you ever run a tabletop exercise to see what happens when all the fire alarms go off? And a lot of people do those things, and then the fire alarms really go off, and it's an absolute disaster because nobody knows who's in charge or what to do. I say that with a smile, but it's awful having been through a few of them. And then the last thing I would add to that around the privacy program is just transparency and communication, so that and again, this really does go to to your staff, right? To your teams. Do they know what to do, right? Do they know what their obligations are as part of that company? especially if they're handling personal information from customers or clients. What's their responsibility in this world? How much training do you have to give them? Do you overtrain, right? As we've seen in some of these trends that Guilda was going through, there are actually, with these fines and repercussions, some of them have outlined that there are like organization level fines of up to X millions of dollars, and then there's individual fines if you're the one snooping or messing around or disclosing data from a company.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the training is really important. Having worked for the French regulator, I also know that the first thing that when the regulator, I think is the same here, investigates is retention. I think if there's one important priority is to define how long you need to keep the data for and have a retention policy, and really think about whether you need to keep that data for 50 years or not. So yeah, that's a little tip from having worked in
and also the end-to-end nature of that retention policy, because we see a lot of organizations that keep that stuff in backup. So sure, it's gone, but it's not really gone.
Yeah.
Question actually from the audience, which is timely to what you just said, Guilda, just around what's the best way to engage employees in privacy training? What have you guys seen be successful, and how do you avoid the it's that online course you have to click through once a year that everyone does, but no one really takes seriously?
So this is a constant topic of conversation amongst me and my team around how we can do this better. Because I agree that what we've come across with a lot of organizations is the first response is, oh my gosh, training, yes, please train my whole staff and let us know all about our privacy obligations. It goes a certain way, right? But each organization has their own stuff, so it's important to understand that. To the flip side of that coin, where it's I have to do this privacy training every year or every 6 months. It makes me want to shoot myself. This is horrible. Like, stop making me do this. I'm not paying attention anyways. So certainly from our perspective, I mean, what we've tried to do is liven it up. One thing, this is not the sexiest topic. I get it. I'm so impressed at how many people are listening to this webinar right now. But at the same time, I mean, as everybody knows, and as we can see as a sort of these laws are a product of all of this, is that it's really important, right? It's really important to understand what your role as an employee is, and how how you fit into the ecosystem of your organization in terms of data management. So yeah, we try not to overdo it, and we're working on like some customizable training solutions as well, where for example, maybe you do click through something as part of an orientation session, but then you get 20 minutes with a live person at the end of it, right? And you can actually ask questions and engage, start talking about, have you ever been in a breach before? I find certainly that I have probably done hundreds of them myself, but that engagement is really, really important, right? And start talking to people and start getting them thinking a little bit about their role in the company. I hope I answered the question okay.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, it's interesting. I won't mention which of the big consultancies you can find it in the news, but there was a huge fine levied this year, right, for internal training practices around specifically privacy and the the fact that they were basically cheating by just doing it as groups and stuff. So this is real deal. Sure.
Well, it's the real deal, and it costs real money, right? These fines. So hopefully people stand up and take notice. We're certainly trying to do a little bit more of a hybrid approach where we can go in and do a privacy 101 training, or we can get really specific and do something around new legislation in Canada. There's also some certification programs around this. Like there's a Canadian certified information privacy professional. It's a real thing. And those tend to be quite helpful because as people get those certifications and see where they fit in the broader picture of the world, it can help because they sort of become the trainers within their organizations as well. But yeah, it really depends on the size of the organization and what you do.
Cool. Maybe we'll keep going on some trends. We can jump back.
Yeah,
Sure.
so yeah, there's one trend that Adam mentioned a little bit is the individual's rights. That is also increasing a lot of new rights for individuals. One of them is maybe you've heard about it, called data mobility or data portability. It's basically, when explaining it is very easy, implementing it is quite hard, knowing also from experience. But it's about an individual being able to say, from asking an organization A to transfer the personal information to an organization B. And typically an example is you have a playlist on Spotify, and now you want to start using Google Music, and you don't want to redo all your playlists all over again. So you just ask Spotify to transfer directly to Google Music. Your playlist. And so this, I think when legislators write the law, they think, oh, that's cool. That should be a cool right. We should do that. But then when you get to the implementation of it, and having worked with EU organizations and also in Canada on it, so there's a lot of questions on, compatibility and interoperability between the systems, and technical feasibility, and the responsibility you have for the transmission of the information, and then for the reuse of the information by the other organization. So Canada, like Quebec, has launched it, but it's the last obligation that will be applicable, I think, in 2024. So there's still some time, and I think obviously it is actually the last obligation that will be enforceable, because I think Quebec was really seeing the challenges that are laying ahead. And other provinces are also thinking about it, but they're, for example, the federal law was talking about a framework that first would be implemented, where organizations would be free to join that framework. And then if two organizations are in that framework, then the portability right can happen. And if they're not, then the organization can say, hey, it's not technically feasible for me to transfer that information to the organization you're asking me to. So there is, just to be more reassuring, there is some anticipation about the difficulty of the implementation of this right. But I think it's because of what happened in the EU, but this is something to be aware of. And even in the US, the state laws are also implementing and making data portability right enforceable. So really new trend to be prepared for. And other new rights, a reinforced right of access, and a new right called the right of de-indexation in Quebec, where if you are on the search engine and there's results appearing, you can ask the search engine or that website that is linking to your name or to your personal information to de-index that if it's causing them prejudice. But again, there's a balance of freedom of expression, and the harm that the individual is going through. So still, we're waiting for some guidance, because this is a very new right, and a right of erasure also. But these are the three trends that we can see across Canada for the new rights of individuals, with, of course, an increased right of transparency and having more information. But we've already tackled that before.
And I mean, realistically, and I think this is a question that came up a lot with GDPR, right? Is how much should smaller organizations be worried about this, and how much is this really being levied at big tech to try to put a price on them being able to exploit people's data the way they have for so long? Like, what's the balance there, and how should organizations be thinking about that?
I guess it would depend on the right we're talking about. Like, some rights are pretty like, the right of access. This is something, if you're well organized, if you have a good privacy program, you should know about the information that you're handling. The right of erasure, to some extent, yes, it might, you should have a process to be able to delete the data. And there's a lot of companies that offer technical tools to be able to do that. But the new rights, like the right of data portability and well, I don't want to get into GDPR, but there's also other rights in the, and when they're, I want to almost say like unexpected, I think there's always a tolerance on smaller organizations, but it's a lot about good faith. And that's what we talked about a little earlier, showing that you care, showing that you've done what you could. that you've keep in writing, record everything you do, or show that you ask yourself the questions and you try to solve them. This is already a big step for regulators, for when they look at smaller organization and like, okay, it's not that they don't care, it's that they couldn't. It's already a good step. I'm not saying it's going to guarantee no fine at all, but usually the process in these cases are more like, okay, we're going to give you a chance to be compliant. And really, if you're really pushing it and you're not making any effort, that's where we would go to the administrative monetary penalties, fines. But there is usually a kind of gradual approach. But for these big tech companies, the tolerance is much lower.
Yeah. And it's I'm just going to jump on that one. I've been very carefully watching the space. I'm sure all tech companies have, and I find it really fascinating, Alec, because that's where the big fines are coming from, right? So these regulators in Europe have gone after Facebook's and Google's Alphabet, and they've been able to sequester massive fines, right, in the tens of millions of dollars. Where for Google, whatever, right? That's not that big of a deal. But for these regulatory bodies, that's a lot of money, right? So I watch it with a very cynical hat on sometimes as to is this a money making opportunity at times? And I'm very I know there's a lot of benevolence and everything in what they're doing, but at the same time, I'm very interested to watch this trend over the years as to follow that money, right? Like, where does it go? Who really benefits from this? Are these regulators getting fancy new offices in London, right? I don't know, but it'll be very interesting in Canada. Very, very interesting to see, because that's one of those very watchdoggy things that Canadians are really, really good at is making sure that things are going to the right spot. So,
well, this is the concern that I maybe personally hold to, is we saw the impact of these laws when cloud technology was on the rise, and how it actually held Canadian technology companies back from doing really innovative things with government in Canada where you can actually really make a difference. And I think finding that balance of those things is going to be a challenge. And maybe on that, so there's a question from the audience here just around beyond the trends, sort of what you see as the side effects of these laws being rolled out, and sort of what are the biggest risks that you see from them?
It's a terrific question. I'll give you my personal opinion. I think the biggest risk of these laws coming out is that they are incongruent, and they say different things. And you've got a company that's headquartered in BC, and pardon my language, but it's W2F. Like, what am I responsible here for? I've got clients right across the country. I've got to comply with that law here. I've got to comply with this law. They all say different things. What do I do? And we see it over and over again. And it's a very real thing, right? It's, like, what do I do? Am I doing all the things that I'm supposed to be doing? I think this same question is way worse in the US, and not to go down that path too much, but it's even more of a patchwork of individual state laws. And again, you got companies that are trying to sell their products or provide their services, and even take that into cloud services, where it's like, what am I really subject here? It's so confusing, and it doesn't need to be, and it shouldn't be. I think, as you'll see, as Gilda's been mentioning with a lot of these trends, I mean, there are some congruencies through this, and again, I think, and that's certainly been our advice with a lot of our clients is just, pick a good one, pick a province or a state or whatever that's holding the highest bar, and go for that bar, because you'd be pretty hard pressed as a regulator to say that you're not doing your due diligence, if you've gone to those lengths. But at the same time, like I really think it's a major risk, a competitive risk too, that other companies from other countries may not want to do business with Canada because we have all these crazy data laws that nobody seems to be able to figure out.
Yeah, sure. Maybe we have time for maybe one more trend.
Well, yeah, the last one, but we've already tackled a little bit, is the breach reporting obligations, that are in BC are going to happen. But even in the other laws, in the other provinces, for the moment, the state of it is that if you have a breach, you have to notify the regulator, your client, if you're a service provider, and eventually the individuals if there's a high risk. But what's interesting is that a province like Quebec is now going a step further and is saying that service providers, for example, have to notify their clients even if they become aware of an attempted violation of the information. So in terms of the amount of notifications that you're going to have to receive, because I think attempted violations must happen every day, and how do you identify them, and then having a process to notify your client, yeah, there was an attempted violation, then that's going to be quite a heavy thing to do. But all the provinces, what they have in common, in addition to BC, who is going to have its first mandatory breach violation notification, is still that they're, a risk-based approach where the higher the risk is for the breach for the individuals and for the company, then the higher the obligations of notification are. So at least there's a coherence here. But Quebec is also now starting to with attempted violations, and now also the other provinces are going towards the fact that service providers must notify their clients if there's been a breach, which wasn't necessarily clearly the case until now.
And it can have such counterintuitive effects too. So if you take that into practical terms, what they're trying to do in Quebec, I mean, imagine if you got an email every second week from whatever company saying, hey, there was an attempted breach from some DNS attack or something like that. Well, then you just stop reading them, right? Nobody cares anymore, right? And then what's the point of doing this in the first place?
It's like the whole cookies thing on all the websites now. GDPR, like who actually reads the cookies you're accepting?
Yeah, well, it's too much, right? It's
there you go. Okay, sure.
Got a good privacy nerd on board here. But it's the same with the notifications, like those notifications to clients. And I've been in a lot of healthcare situations where that question came up. It's like, okay, there was a breach, like there was a USB stick found on the ground or something like that. Yeah. Do we really need to notify all of these people? Like, we found it, like, is it how much damage it has been done? And some people are like, yes, absolutely, CYA and send out these notification letters, which used to be like by mail. But in a lot of cases, you can cause a lot more harm than good from sending around stuff like that. Same thing. There was this USB incident that I remember, and a lot of the patients that were on there were part of a mental health program. And it's like, okay, well, you got to think, maybe talk to some doctors before you start firing this stuff out the door. And every physician that we spoke to is like, don't bother. You're just going to cause nothing but grief, and for what? Like, what are we really doing here? So there is that balance that needs to be struck. And I think Quebec's going, my 2 cents, a little too far in their reaction to it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, especially because we're talking about clients here, but also, like, this applies to everything. Like, you think about information we hold on candidates that have applied for roles and stuff like that. If there's even an attempt on us on that data to have to contact all those folks over and over again, it's going to get unreasonable.
You're going to lose a lot of candidates, aren't you?
Well, and I mean, just think of how many times you share your own data in a day. It's just insane. So
yeah,
we reach after the consent fatigue, it will be the breach notification fatigue.
Yeah, exactly. Consent fatigue and then notification fatigue. We have a couple of minutes. I'd be really curious, just from both of you, looking at the audience we have on this call, it's a breakdown between sort of leaders of organizations, employees at all levels. So just curious as to the one thing that, despite all this legislation, despite all this noise that's coming, what's the thing that you think that people should have front of mind when it comes to privacy to sort of do the right things in this space, regardless of what your role is with the company?
What a great question. Go ahead, Gilda.
I would say know what you're doing with the data, and be transparent. If there's two things I think I would keep like as a highlights of everything, I would say this too, personally, my first reaction.
Well, and I would extend that, and that's a really good answer. It's beautiful in its simplicity, right? Because I think that goes down to the individual level. And I think at the company level as well, those CEOs and CTOs and CIOs, it costs money, sometimes to spend time and put things in place and to be transparent about it, like legitimately transparent about it. It's one of the reasons we've really enjoyed working with Thrive over the years is because you guys are proactive about this stuff. Like you're going after this, and it's great. I think it really demonstrates to people around you and to your clients and customers as well what kind of organization you're dealing with, and what kind of organization you are is going to become a lot more known and open with these new laws. I think those that are harboring shady data management practices are going to get a giant spotlight shone on them.
Yeah, and I think the transparency is a huge theme of that. I'm not sure it's sort of late breaking this morning, but if you look at the new Ontario Employment Act that's being proposed, there's a whole clause that they're not limiting what you can do in terms of employee surveillance, but now you have to disclose sort of every aspect of it. And I think that's how you reduce the fatigue aspects of this, is really just being transparent about these things and letting people digest it. So
yeah,
cool. I want to thank you both for your time. I know this is what you guys do every day, and it's incredible to have a chance to talk to you both. You have a wealth of knowledge and a really great way of distilling this down into something that others can understand. So appreciate you both joining us today. Thanks to everyone who made time out of their day to join us or to listen to the recording. And just a huge thank you to our team at Thrive for putting these together. There's a lot of work behind the scenes that goes into these. So have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday, and thanks for making time to join us for our grand round.
Thank you for having us.
It was a pleasure.
Really appreciate it. Thanks. Bye, guys.